Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. And this morning, it is all about the coronavirus vaccine. Joining us to talk about the latest is the Post's Yasmeen Abu-Taleb, a national reporter focused on healthcare. Yasmeen, welcome to First Look.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Looks like we could have not one, but two coronavirus vaccines before Christmas. The vaccine developed by Pfizer was approved last week, but now there's a vaccine by Moderna, which is likely to receive emergency authorization this week. I'm kind of guessing. You're the reporter. What's the actual timeline we're looking at here?
You're absolutely right. The expectation is that Moderna's vaccine gets authorized by the end of this week. The FDA's advisory committee is meeting today to review the safety and efficacy data, and it's expected that they sign off and authorize Moderna's vaccine by Saturday. So it looks like there will be two vaccines by the end of this week.
Wow. So authorization by Saturday, which means in terms of actually getting the vaccine into the arms of Americans, what's the timeline of how soon that will be available?
As soon as Sunday, that Moderna's vaccine will start being distributed. So there are about 3 million doses of Pfizer's vaccine that have been distributed this week or are currently being distributed, and then they'll add Moderna's to that next week.
All right. So then what is the difference between the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine? Is there one?
Well, they're actually very similar vaccines. They both relied on new technology that had never been used in a vaccine before, but there's been years of research on it, this mRNA technology, that it looked very promising. It looked like they could speed up the normal timeline for vaccine development, and that bet seems to have paid off for both companies. They both were the first out of the gate by far, and they actually have had the most promising trials. AstraZeneca at one point looked like the most promising candidate, and that trial's hit a number of speed bumps. So these two so far look to be the most effective. They're both around 95% effective, which is incredible for a vaccine that's as effective as the most effective childhood vaccines. And this new technology seems to have really paid off.
Pfizer has pointed out several times during this whole thing that it has not taken any funding from Operation Warp Speed. What about Moderna?
Moderna actually relied very heavily on Operation Warp Speed. They had about a $4 billion investment from the government to get through their research and development. They're not a very big company. They're not like Pfizer where they can self-fund research and development. Pfizer put in about $2 billion of its own money to do the trials however it wanted without any government interference. Moderna, on the other hand, would have not been able to develop it this quickly had it not been for that huge investment.
So one of the things that was reported yesterday was there was a healthcare worker in Alaska who had a serious allergic reaction to the Pfizer vaccine. Have you heard any additional information on this incident, and should we expect more cases like that?
It's hard to tell because it's so early in the distribution. So there's obviously going to be heightened attention on any adverse effects to the vaccine beyond the sort of normal fever and chills that are expected. The strange thing about that case in Alaska is that the woman who had the allergic reaction had no known allergies. There were reported cases in Britain of two people who had allergic reactions, but they had known allergies. This woman did not. So we know that she was given an EpiPen afterwards that helped lessen the severity of some of her symptoms. And then she had to spend the night in the hospital. She had an Epi drip. She seems to be doing okay now, but I think we can definitely expect there to be a lot of media attention and just heightened awareness of any potential adverse effects, since this is such new territory for everyone.
And Yasmeen, correct me if my memory is not quite right, but that's one of the reasons why once they give you the vaccine, they hold you over for about 15 minutes just to see what kind of reaction you might have.
That's exactly right. So there were scientists, members of the vaccine advisory committee saying, look, this proves that the process is working as it should. They documented the adverse event. The woman had been sitting there for 15 minutes and the reaction happened about 10 minutes in. And that's exactly why they have that protocol in place.
Okay, let's talk about the vaccine supply, because we've heard that the Trump administration is negotiating with Pfizer to secure more vaccines in order to meet its goal of inoculating most Americans by spring or early summer. Will the authorization of the Moderna vaccine change the calculus of this?
It doesn't actually, because it was built into the government's assumptions about how many people it was going to be able to vaccinate by early spring, early summer. So they've purchased 200 million doses of Moderna's vaccine, which is enough to vaccinate about 100 million people. After the Pfizer supply chain issues emerged, they had announced that they had come to an agreement to purchase another 100 million doses of Moderna's vaccine that they'll be able to distribute by the summer. Now we know that there are negotiations with Pfizer to try to procure a few million more doses, because right now the supply they have is only enough to vaccinate about half the country by the summer. And that's if, another vaccine candidate doesn't come through. They say they're hopeful that Johnson & Johnson will be approved soon. That's a single shot, so it's a little bit easier than the 2-dose vaccine that Moderna and Pfizer have. But these are not sure things. So if we're looking at what we know we'll have, right now there's not enough to vaccinate the entire country by next summer.
Interesting. Let's talk about the 2-dose vaccine regimen. Some health officials, like former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, have said that it's better to give as many people as possible the first dose and then catching up to the second dose when supply increases. What are you hearing on this front?
I think most health officials have talked about doing the 2-dose regimen as it's intended, where the shots are 3 or 4 weeks apart, because that's where you get the 95% efficacy. Scott Gottlieb is saying, you get about 50% efficacy after just the first dose. So it might be better to protect a larger portion of the country, even if it's less effective, because then you would have, a broader swath of protection. I think most health officials at this point think the 2-dose regimen should be distributed as it's laid out. But, it's obviously a topic for debate, especially because of how catastrophic the outbreak is in the United States right now. So is it better to have some protection in more people, or stronger protection in a smaller number of people, especially healthcare workers, who are most exposed to this?
I mean, using Scott Gottlieb's logic, it has me wondering if there's a risk of people not showing up for the second vaccine and then wasting vaccine.
Right. I mean, this 2-dose regimen is already a big logistical challenge, just in terms of tracking who got the first dose when and making sure they show up for the second dose. It's much easier in a workplace where you're vaccinating healthcare officials, because it's in the workplace, it's easier to monitor. But when we start getting into the general population, this is something that officials are worried about. How do you monitor all of this? How do you, ensure they got Pfizer's vaccine or Moderna's vaccine, and you make sure that they get that second dose so everyone has that really strong protection?
Yes, we're running out of time, but I got to ask you about this other report. The New York Times came out with a story yesterday about the politicization of the CDC. A chief of staff and his deputy described the Trump administration's, quote, dismissal of science, the White House's slow suffocation of the agency's voice, the meddling in its messages, and the siphoning of its budget. Given your extensive reporting, is this revelation a surprise?
It's not a surprise. I think it's obviously there's much more weight to it when you have 2 people on the record who were really in the thick of it. But it's in line with everything we and the New York Times and other outlets have reported all year, that there's been enormous politicization of the CDC this year.
All right. And with that, Yasmeen Abutaleb, we got to go. Thank you so much for coming on First Look.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find my colleagues, Washington Post columnists, Megan McArdle and E.J. Dionne. Megan, E.J., welcome.
Great to be with you. That was a great discussion with Yasmeen. She's awesome. Thank
you.
Isn't
she? We packed in, she packed in a lot of information from the questions, but let's stay on the vaccine and the I can never say that word. I don't know how many times I've said it on First Look.
The first time.
All right, politicization of the CDC for a moment. EJ, I'm going to start with you. How can institutions like the CDC regain their credibility with a fearful and weary public?
Well, I think new leadership actually makes a difference. I mean, this is a clear case where whatever your politics are, unless you're an ardent Trumpist, the notion that Joe Biden is coming in and he will behave like a traditional president, whether a Republican or a Democratic president, who respects expertise, who appoints people to places like the CDC and relies on their judgment and their knowledge. Really quite unusual in our history. And so I'm hoping new leadership will make the difference.
That was really fun. You froze there for a second. We thought we lost you, but you came back, EJ. We got you.
Sorry about that. I always say if my connection is unstable, I hope I am not anyway. But thank you.
No. You are not unstable. Megan, you recently wrote about the importance of trust in messaging and the perils of downplaying the side effects of these vaccines. How can public officials encourage vaccination without neglecting to warn the public about side effects? And how do you thread this needle, so to speak?
Well, I think one thing to emphasize is that the side effects are actually in a way good. They don't feel good when you're going through them. It could well feel like you're having kind of flu, the fatigue, the muscle pain, the fever. But you should think about this as your immune system kind of running training exercises so that when the actual virus shows up, you're going to be ready to go. The commandos are going to be parachuted in there immediately, and they're going to take care of the emerging threat. And so I think one way to do it is to frame this as like, look, if you're having side effects, that's showing that your immune system is ready to fight COVID. That's actually what we're looking for. But more importantly, I think we have to make sure people are aware that that's going to happen. And we have to make sure people are aware, too, that, if we just injected the population with saline, which completely harmless, no side effects, we would still have some number of people would get the shot and 2 days later they would have a heart attack and die, or they would be diagnosed with cancer, or something else would happen because in a large population, those things are always going on. And if people aren't prepared for that, there's a real danger that what happens is, dad got the shot, he had a heart attack, and then daughter, grief-stricken, takes to social media and says, don't get this shot, dad killed my father. And so we need to prepare people so that we need them to be so bored with the message that the side effects are coming, it's okay, it's expected, it's actually good, that by the time they see that message on social media, everyone just kind of rolls their eyes and says, no, that's actually what we were told this was going to happen. This is not surprising, it's not unusual, I'm still getting my shot.
And I hear you, but I keep going back to the notion or the fact that we have millions of people who don't believe that there is even a pandemic. So back to the issue of trust, given what you just said, Megan, do you fear that we have almost half the country, perhaps, that isn't going to heed any message when it comes to the vaccine?
Look, I think America has an anti-vaxxer problem, and that was always going to exist. That said, I think one of the things, certainly not the only thing, Donald Trump has played an enormous role in politicizing this and making a lot of his followers sort of hostile to the idea of doing anything about the virus. But that said, Mike Pence is going to get inoculated on camera, which I think is going to be really helpful with that group of people. But more broadly, I think we have to acknowledge that part of the reason that they find it so easy to distrust what experts say is that the experts have often had this kind of mama knows best attitude. If you think about going back to March, the masks, where people were saying, don't wear masks, they only help healthcare workers, which didn't really make any sense. And then came out and said, no, everyone wear masks. That breeds a huge amount of distrust. And I understand why people did that. They were afraid people would hoard masks that healthcare workers desperately needed. But if we had treated people like adults and said, look, masks can help. We need the N95 mask for healthcare workers. But if you have, put something over your face, that would have been a way better message, and I think would have solved some, by no means all, but some of the problems that we are now having. And I would hate to see us make that same mistake again. If we wait for people to find out that these vaccines have bad side effects, that information is not going to get lost. People aren't going to forget to mention it. Instead, they're going to terrify their friends. And so we need to be out in front of that, saying, yes, side effects, because side effects mean your immune system is learning how to deal with the virus. When you get the flu, all the bad side effects, that's not actually the virus doing that. That's your body fighting the virus that causes the fever and all the rest of it.
And that is a good point for us to remember. Side effects means your body's fighting. EJ, let's turn to politics. And the inability of some Republicans to just let the election go. It's President-elect Joe Biden. Anyway, you wrote that the 18 Republican state attorneys general and the 126 Republican members of Congress who've basically claimed the election fraud may be, quote, you wrote that the election fraud may be more impudent than the Civil War seditionists. Sedition is a strong word. What do you say to those who might think that goes too far?
Well, first of all, I want to praise Megan for the idea of the immune system running exercises. We need cartoons of that. I want to see what that looks like, because that's exactly right. What I wrote in that column is at least the Civil War secessionists, the Confederate secessionists, acknowledge that Abraham Lincoln actually won the 1860 election. In this case, what you have are attorneys generals, Republican attorneys general, almost 2/3 of Republicans in the House of Representatives saying, we had an election, the votes were counted, we don't like the result, so we think the court should set aside the result that the people reached, that the verdict that the people issued, and we should install our guy against the wishes of a president who won a clear majority in the Electoral College and a 7 million vote margin in the popular vote, a majority of the popular vote. This is so entirely against our traditions, and it really undermines faith in the electoral system when it actually operated quite well, precinct by precinct, town by town, city by city, with local people running these elections. And I also think they're laying the groundwork for taking back what we did in this election, which was to make it easier for people to vote in the pandemic. And what we saw is that if you make access to the ballot easier, more people will vote. We want to keep that going, not take it back.
Fancy that. Make it easier to vote. People will show up. But EJ, one of the things about that, about that Texas lawsuit, one of the theories was that all these people, those 126 Republican members of Congress, signed on to it precisely because they knew it was going nowhere. So what do you say to those folks who say, oh, come on, just leave it alone. It was no big deal. This is no threat to the Republic.
You know, you and I take very seriously what we say, even if we don't think a column we write will have any effect on policy. We pray that it might, but we take what we say seriously. These are public officials. We count on public officials at their best to say what they mean and not play fast and loose with our institutions. That is about the most unconservative thing you can do. A brilliant conservative writer, Yuval Levin, wrote a great book on how we need to strengthen, not weaken, our institutions. And for people who call themselves conservative, call themselves, by the way, states' rights advocates, and then say, sorry, Texas and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Michigan, we're going to override what your states did. This is so inconsistent and so violative of the support Democratic, Republican institutions, I use both words, need and deserve.
Megan, let me let you in on this. What do you think about the behavior of the Republican minority in the House?
I think it's appalling. I think it though reflects a kind of larger trend, and it tells us something about our political system. And the larger trend is that both sides are increasingly refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the president from the other party. And you see the 76% of Democrats apparently think that Donald Trump wasn't really elected president, and that the Russian interference and so forth gave him the election, which is very unlikely to be true. The difference is, though, that Hillary Clinton conceded. And I think what that tells you is that the important role that elites are still playing in kind of forcing us to a consensus, right? Forcing us to say, okay, Yes. Yes, this like, you may think that this is not legitimate, but still we respect the institutions, and that's what Trump doesn't have. But I will say that Hillary Clinton in 2019 was saying that he was not a legitimate president, right? I mean, this is an incredibly dangerous game that both sides have been playing. Trump has taken this so much farther and dragged Republican officials along with him. And I think it is appalling that knowing how damaging this is to institutions, and also, by the way, knowing that this is false, right? There is no chance that the Republicans in Congress who signed on to these absurd lawsuits actually believe that the substantive claims are correct, right? That is, first of all, just on a personal level, deeply immoral, and second of all, on a political level, completely corrosive. And I fear for where this is taking us in the future, and I fear in some ways, right, that if next time a Republican wins, if Democrats do something like this and Republicans complain, on what leg are they standing when they complain, right? I think we are just entering into phenomenally dangerous territory that goes well beyond the particulars of these Republicans or even Donald Trump, and into the future of our republic.
But
Jonathan, could I just respectfully disagree with Megan on one point? I agree with most of what she said. But I think that both sidesism is a mistake here. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, lost those states by a smaller margin than Donald Trump did, the 3 key states in the Midwest. She conceded right away. No Democrat said, a lot of us said the Electoral College is a bad idea. I think the Electoral College is a bad idea. None of us said his election was illegitimate. And the evidence of Russian interference in our election, this is our own CIA. That was not made up. That was a real thing. What Trump and the Republicans are talking about are entirely made up things. And I really do think it's important. Yes, we're polarized and all that, but I really think it's important to draw a sharp distinction between what Republicans are saying now about Joe Biden's victory and what Democrats said about Russian interference. I don't think it's the same deal.
Let me push back on that a little bit. Like, look, on the one hand, I agree with you. As I say, this is a sharp break and it is appalling and inexcusable. But let's be honest, a lot of Democrats thought that the Mueller investigation was going to turn up evidence that Trump was a Manchurian candidate who'd sold out the country. And a lot of people in the media and a lot of politicians let them think that because they kind of believed it. Right? This is actually a problem that goes beyond just these people. The reason Trump can do this is that trust in our institutions is so badly eroded on both sides that we have gotten to a point where no one wants to acknowledge that the other party could win an election and legitimately govern. And I think that does play into a lot of the problems we have. That does not excuse what Trump is doing. It does not excuse what the Republicans are doing. And rather, it actually creates the ground where what they are doing makes a bad situation even worse. But I think that to deny that bad situation exists, to frame this as only a problem of Trump or the Republican Party, is incredibly dangerous, because then it lets us think, oh, well, if we just defeated them, the problem would be over. It is not over. We have two sides in this country who do not fundamentally disagree with the kind of basic proposition that the other side gets to make the rules sometimes and they have to compromise.
And again, we could go around like this. I don't disagree with the right of people I disagree with to govern the country. The people I disagree with have governed the country for a lot of my lifetime, and I did not deny their right under the democratic rules of our country to govern. So I think what's going on now on the Republican side really is quite different, but we will argue this some more.
I'm just saying, these trends one did not see 20 years ago in terms of just the base electorate not accepting that they lost. And I think that really is different. Anyway, I'll let it go there.
And we'll be back with more Wimbledon after. No, I'm kidding. I do have to ask, there is one more hurdle, which in elections past, no one would have even noticed. But in this one, everyone, well, I'm paying attention to it, and I'm sure Megan and EJ, you both are, and that is January 6th. And that is when Congress will count the electoral votes, and that is the official certification and declaration that President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have indeed won the election that will be presided over the president of the Senate, who happens to be the vice president of the United States, Mike Pence. Is there any concern? Do either of you have concerns that Vice President Pence will not do what his predecessors have done, even those who have lost, and that is declare their Democratic opponents the winner? Vice President Al Gore had to declare President George W. Bush the winner. Joe Biden had to declare President Trump the winner when they met in 2017. Any danger that Vice President Pence will not follow suit?
It wouldn't shock me if we learned the day before that Vice President Pence announces that he has to quarantine himself and figure out some other way to avoid this duty, because it puts him in a terrible situation. He wants to be the guy who represents the Trump constituency if he has any future going forward. And so he'll be seen as a traitor the minute he pronounces those words. And yet his duty as vice president will be to ratify those results the way Al Gore did against himself that day. I recently heard some tape of that, and it's remarkable. Or Joe Biden did with Donald Trump. The other question, of course, is will some Republican senator be willing to support a challenge to the result that House members will offer? And apparently Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, is trying to discourage any senator from coming forward to create that other hurdle to the count.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Megan?
Look, I also think it's not impossible that Mike Pence could, for example, have a sudden and tragic case of bone spurs that would prevent him from showing up to
excellent choice
the results in the Senate. You can't put anything past them. This is ultimately the problem with the Trump administration. In any other administration, I would be like, that's absurd. It's ridiculous to even think about that they wouldn't do this. And I really do have great sympathy for Al Gore. It must have been one of the hardest days of his life.
Seriously.
But that said, I don't think that the Senate is gonna, rebel against this. I think at this point, Mitch McConnell is saying, Joe Biden is the president-elect. But I do think that Mike Pence might just find some reason that he is unable to do that.
Right. I saw a report at another institution whose name I honestly cannot remember right now, that the reporting is that Vice President Pence will preside over the January 6th ceremony and then flee the country on a planned trip to the Middle East. But we'll run that down. Two quick questions that we got to squeeze in 4 minutes. First, President-elect Joe Biden, we have the story in the paper today that he has been behind the scenes trying to work things out so that he can actually work with the Senate, particularly if it's Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell after the Georgia runoffs. Do either of you think that the sort of kumbaya that he is hoping to have will actually happen, given the obstruction that he faced when he was vice president to President Obama?
I tend to think that this is structural at this point, that, I think Yuval Levin has made this point very well, which is that Congress now turns over so much. It's more than basically any time in American history since the 19th century. Because control of Congress turns over so much, neither side has any incentive to make deals.
Right.
What they want to do is wait and see if they can get it all. And you saw this, you've frankly seen this with Democrats on COVID relief, as well as obviously with Republicans for the entire Obama presidency, 6 years of it anyway, is that we are now in a structural place where it's actually just nearly impossible to get Congress to do anything, because everyone feels like they have more incentive to hold out and see if they can get the trifecta.
And EJ, on this question?
Yeah, as you know, I have a column in today's paper saying Joe Biden is tougher than people are giving him credit for. I thought it was very significant that this week, first, that speech he gave on Monday, which really took the Republicans to task for their anti-democratic behavior in denying the election. And then he went down to Georgia and campaigned, which, by the way, Barack Obama did not do in 2008 when there was a runoff down there. because Biden is very aware that to get anything done, not radical stuff, not socialist stuff, just basic stuff done, he needs a Democratic majority.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, he is going to reach out to some Republicans like Mitt Romney, like Susan Collins, to try to build something broader, because even if both seats in Georgia go Democratic, it'll still be 50-50.
Right. And real quickly, because now we have less than a minute left, will we see a coronavirus stimulus bill agreed to by Congress, thereby bringing relief to the American people just before Christmas? Megan first.
I tend to think not, but I wouldn't bet either way at this point.
Oh, EJ, are you as pessimistic?
I think they are going to make a deal, partly because of the Georgia races, where